The shopkeeper snatched the dented milk tin right out of Caleb Mercer's hands. Not gently, not with any pretense of courtesy. He grabbed it the way a man grabs something that belongs to him, fast, careless, contemptuous, and slammed it down on the counter so hard the sound cracked through the store like a gunshot. "You think credit grows on trees, boy?" Harold Fitch leaned across the counter until his face was close enough that Caleb could smell pipe tobacco and yesterday's whiskey on his breath. "Return it, every penny, or I'll have the sheriff pull that baby right out of your worthless arms and hand him to someone who can actually feed him." The entire store went silent. Every single person in that room heard it, and every single person looked away. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they remind you that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happens next in this store, what one woman decides to do in the next 60 seconds, is going to stay with you for a very long time. Now, let's go back to that store. Let's go back to Caleb Mercer, standing there with his infant son pressed against his chest. And let's watch what happens when the wrong person finally sees the right thing. The morning Caleb Mercer walked into Fitch's general store, he had exactly 4 cents in his left coat pocket, and a prayer he no longer believed in somewhere behind his ribs. It was the kind of October morning that Colorado didn't ease you into. The cold came overnight without apology, settled into the mud streets and the wooden storefronts, and the gaps beneath every door in Durango, and it announced itself the way a creditor does, without warmth, without patience, without any interest in your circumstances. Caleb had woken before dawn with Noah screaming in the crib beside him, the baby's face red and furious, tiny fists clenched at the air, the blanket damp from where Caleb had packed it with his own spare shirt in the night trying to hold the heat in. He'd run out of milk 2 days ago. He'd run out of coal 4 days before that. What he had left was the dented tin of formula he'd bought on credit 3 weeks ago and still hadn't fully paid for, half a cord of unsplit firewood that he'd been promised in exchange for 2 days of fence labor but hadn't yet received, and a baby boy who was 7 months old and had never once in his short life done a single thing to deserve any of this. Caleb pulled Noah tighter against his chest as he pushed open the door to Fitch's. The bell above the frame gave a cheerful little ring that felt almost insulting. He nodded at the 2 men nearest the door, railroad workers, judging by their boots and their silence, and made his way toward the back counter where Harold Fitch stood behind a wall of shelved goods, making notes in a leather-bound ledger with the focused expression of a man who took money very personally. "Mr. Fitch," Caleb said. Fitch didn't look up. "Mercer. I need to talk to you about my account." "I know what you need to talk about." Fitch still didn't look up. He made another note, slow and deliberate, the way men do when they want you to understand that your time is worth less than their ink. "You're behind." "I know I'm behind. I've been looking for work since the Dalton mine closed. I've had 3 interviews this week, and 2 of them said they might have something by..." "Might." Fitch finally set down his pen and looked at Caleb with the particular flat expression of a man who had stopped seeing the person in front of him a long time ago. "Might doesn't pay your tab, son." Caleb shifted Noah to his other arm. The baby had quieted some, his head resting heavy against Caleb's shoulder, the small, warm weight of him the only good thing in the room. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking you for 2 more weeks. That's all. 2 weeks and I'll..." "2 weeks." Fitch set it back like a punchline. He stepped around the counter, and for a moment Caleb thought maybe he was coming to meet him halfway, man to man, some gesture of basic human consideration. Instead, Fitch walked straight to the shelf where Caleb had originally pulled the milk tin 3 weeks ago, examined a row of identical cans with an air of professional disdain, and turned back around with his arms crossed. "You still got the tin I sold you?" "Yes, sir." "Bring it." Caleb hesitated. "It's half empty. Noah's been..." "I don't care if it's all empty. Bring me what's left and we'll settle the difference." Fitch uncrossed his arms and held out one flat hand, palm up, like a schoolteacher waiting on a homework assignment. "Or don't. But if you don't, I'm adding your whole balance to the sheriff's collection list by end of week. Your choice." Caleb looked at that hand. He looked at it for a long moment, and then, because he didn't have a better option, and because he'd promised himself a year ago, The night his wife Clara died in that hospital bed with the one good candle burning down to nothing, that he would never let his son see him beg, he reached into his coat and pulled out the dented milk tin and set it in Harold Fitch's outstretched hand. That was when Fitch grabbed it. Not took it. Grabbed it. Yanked it from Caleb's grip the way you snatch something back from someone who was never supposed to have it, and slammed it on the counter hard enough that Noah startled awake and let out a sharp cry, and the two railroad men by the door both flinched at the sound. "You think credit grows on trees, boy?" Caleb didn't answer. He was focused on Noah, pressing his hand against the back of the baby's head, rubbing small circles, the way Clara used to do. "It's okay," the gesture said. "I've got you. Everything is fine." Neither of them believed it fully. "Return it, every penny." Fitch's voice had risen enough now that the whole store could hear him perfectly. There were maybe 8 or 9 people in that room. A pair of women in good wool coats near the dry goods, a young clerk restocking a shelf, an older man reading a newspaper by the window, and a woman Caleb had noticed when he came in, standing very still near the back wall, dressed in dark clothing, watching without expression. "Or I'll have the sheriff pull that baby right out of your worthless arms and hand him to someone who can actually feed him." The silence after that sentence was the worst kind. Not the silence of shock, the silence of people who'd decided this wasn't their problem. The two women turned back to their shopping. The clerk found something very important to arrange on a lower shelf. The man with the newspaper turned a page. Caleb felt his face go hot, which surprised him, because he'd thought he was past the stage of shame. He'd spent 11 months since Clara's death being humiliated by circumstances he hadn't chosen, and he'd believed somewhere along the way he'd built some kind of scar tissue over the part of him that could still be wounded in public. Apparently not. "I'm not asking for charity," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, which somehow made it worse. "I'm asking for time. Time is money, Mercer, and you don't got either one." "His name is Noah." Caleb said it before he could stop himself. He didn't know exactly why he said it. Maybe because Fitch had been talking about his son for the last 2 minutes, as if the baby were a line item on a ledger, and not a human being who had a name and a birthday, and who laughed, a genuine squeal of delight, whenever Caleb held him up near the window to watch the horses go by. "His name is Noah. He's 7 months old. His mother is dead, and I am not asking you to carry me forever. I'm asking you for 2 weeks." Fitch stared at him. "2 weeks?" Fitch repeated, with something worse than contempt now, something close to amusement. "You know how many men have walked in here and asked me for 2 weeks?" He counted on his fingers, theatrical, playing to whatever audience he imagined he had. Bricklayer, sheep farmer, schoolteacher, 2 miners. You know what they all had in common with you? He dropped his hand. Not a single one of them was good for it. "I will be." Fitch picked up the milk tin and set it behind the counter. Then he reached under the register and produced a small piece of paper, which he slid across the wood toward Caleb. "That's what you owe. Total. With the milk, with what you picked up in September. I've written it all out nice and clear so there's no argument about the numbers." Caleb looked at the paper. It was more than he'd thought. Not by much, but by enough. "I can't—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't have that right now." "I know you don't." Fitch was already walking back to his ledger. "End of week, Mercer. Good morning." Caleb stood at that counter for another few seconds. Not because he had anything else to say. He was just having a small private argument with himself about whether his legs were going to cooperate, because there was something about being dismissed in front of strangers that made the muscles in a man's body uncertain about basic functions. Noah made a small sound against his shoulder. Hungry, cold, patient in the way that infants are patient, which is to say, not patient at all, just not yet old enough to understand that waiting is optional. Caleb turned around. He made it 3 steps toward the door before the voice came from behind him. Not from Fitch, not from any of the people who'd been watching, from the woman in the dark coat near the back wall, who had not moved once since he'd come in. "Mr. Fitch!" Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had a quality to it that Caleb would struggle to describe later. Not commanding exactly, not the kind of loud authority that rattles windows, but rather the quiet of someone who had never in their life needed to raise their voice to be heard, because the world had always gone quiet when she spoke. Fitch turned from his ledger with mild irritation. "Mrs. Ashcroft." She walked to the counter. She moved without hurry, which itself felt like a statement. She set her small leather purse on the wood, opened it, and withdrew a folded bill that she placed on the counter with one finger, pressing it flat. "This gentleman's account," she said, "settled in full." The store went silent again, but a different kind of silent this time. Fitch looked at the bill. He looked at Evelyn Ashcroft. He was running a rapid calculation behind his eyes that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how much he could afford to argue with a woman whose cattle operation paid for roughly a quarter of his store's annual revenue. "Mrs. Ashcroft, that's very— and I'll take 2 tins of that formula," she said, gesturing toward the shelf where the milk was stocked. "Have them wrapped, please." She turned and looked directly at Caleb for the first time. Not at Noah. At Caleb. "Is 2 sufficient for now, or would you prefer 3? Caleb opened his mouth. He closed it again. In 33 years he had received compliments, received criticism, received the particular crushing sympathy of people at his wife's funeral who meant well and said all the wrong things. But he had never once been asked by a stranger whether 2 or 3 was sufficient, in a tone that suggested the answer genuinely mattered. 2, he said. "Ma'am, 2 is— that's more than enough, but I don't—" He stopped, tried again. "I don't accept charity. I'm not offering it." She turned back to Fitch with the calm efficiency of someone processing an ordinary transaction. "I'm offering employment, if that's agreeable to him." A brief pause. "Assuming Mr. Fitch will finish wrapping those tins sometime today." Fitch started wrapping. The women in the wool coats were staring openly now. The man with the newspaper had put it down. The clerk on the lower shelf had abandoned all pretense of productivity and was simply standing and watching. Evelyn Ashcroft paid no visible attention to any of them. Caleb shifted Noah again, looked down at his son's face. The baby was watching this strange woman with the wide, unfocused curiosity that very young children reserve for anything unexpected, those dark eyes blinking slowly. And Caleb felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in almost a year. Not hope exactly. He was too tired for hope, too burned by the version of hope that had carried him through 6 months of job applications and 2 months of odd work and 1 devastating week when he'd actually believed the Dalton mine would be reopened under new ownership and everything might stabilize. What he felt was something smaller and harder to name than hope. The word that came closest was attention. Someone was paying attention, and not the attention of pity, not the kind that looks at you and sees the sad story first, the kind that looks at you and sees— what? He didn't know yet, but something. "What kind of employment?" he asked. "The kind that involves honest work and honest pay." She accepted the paper-wrapped package from Fitch, turned and offered it to Caleb with both hands. "I have a property on the north side of the ridge that's been sitting empty for 3 years. The main cottage needs rebuilding. The fencing on the lower pasture is collapsed in 4 places. The orchard hasn't been tended in longer than that." She paused. "There's also a smaller structure attached to the cottage that could be made habitable quickly. Heat-able, functional, private, which I imagine matters to you right now more than the salary." She wasn't wrong. "Who'd be watching him?" Caleb asked. He looked down at Noah. "While I'm working. There's a woman on the property, Martha Greer. She's been the groundskeeper's wife since before the property was mine. She's raised 4 children of her own and will take better care of your son than any nursery in the city, which I'm also prepared to verify in writing if that's something you need." Caleb studied her face. He was trying to find the angle. Every offer in his experience had an angle. The mine foreman who'd offered housing in the company row had charged twice fair rent and taken it from wages. The church that had offered a meal after Clara's funeral had followed it with a request for tithing commitments. There was always a cost disguised as a kindness, and he'd learned that lesson the way men learn expensive lessons, by paying for it. Evelyn Ashcroft looked back at him without blinking. There was something in her expression that was difficult to read. Not warmth exactly, not coldness either, something more like assessment. like she was watching to see what he was made of and was genuinely uncertain which direction the answer would go. "Why?" he asked. It came out more directly than he intended, but she didn't flinch. "Because I need the work done," she said. "And you need work to do. Those two facts don't require a more complicated explanation than that." "That's not an answer." Something shifted in her face, very slightly, not quite a smile. The line of her mouth didn't change, but something behind her eyes that might have been, in different light, the first fraction of respect. "No," she said. "It isn't." She picked up her purse. "I'll be at the North Ridge property at 8 tomorrow morning. If you come, bring the boy and we'll introduce him to Martha. If you don't come—" She glanced once at Fitch, then back at Caleb. "Then I suppose Mr. Fitch's generosity will have to suffice." She walked out. The bell above the door rang again, cheerful and indifferent, the same sound it made when anybody left. Caleb stood in the middle of Fitch's general store with 2 tins of formula wrapped in brown paper in his arms and a baby on his shoulder, and 9 different strangers pretending they hadn't just witnessed every second of what happened. "That's Evelyn Ashcroft," the older man with the newspaper said. He'd apparently decided commentary was now appropriate. "Richest widow in the territory." "I know who she is," Caleb said. He didn't, actually. He'd heard the name. Everybody in Durango had heard the name, but hearing a name and knowing who it belonged to were different things, and right now what he knew was this. His son was hungry. His coat had a hole in the left elbow that he'd patched twice with different thread, and a woman he had never spoken to before today had just settled his debts and offered him a cottage, and asked him nothing in return except whether 2 tins or 3 was sufficient. He walked out into the cold Colorado morning. The sky above the street was the particular gray of a day that hasn't decided yet whether to snow. Noah made a sound against his neck. Not crying, just present. Just there. "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I know." He stood on the wooden boardwalk for a long moment, holding his son, watching the horses and the wagon traffic move up the frozen street, thinking about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and a woman who walked out of a store without looking back like she already knew he'd show up. The problem, the real problem, not the one involving coal or money or collapsed fencing, was that she was probably right. He'd show up. He didn't know why. He didn't trust it. He didn't trust her or himself or the strange flat-footed feeling in his chest that he'd mistaken briefly for something other than desperation. But Noah needed somewhere warm. And Caleb Mercer, for all his pride and all his caution and all the hard lessons that 11 months of widowhood and poverty had hammered into him, was still, underneath everything, a man who showed up. He pulled his coat tighter around his son and started walking. Behind him, through the glass window of Fitch's general store, 8 pairs of eyes followed him down the street. None of them said a word. But one of them, the older man, the one with the newspaper, set it down on the counter when Caleb was finally out of sight, took a long breath, and said to no one in particular, "Well, I'll be." And Harold Fitch, tallying numbers in his ledger, said nothing at all, because the numbers all added up fine now. And that was, in the end, what mattered to Harold Fitch. The rest of it, the man with the hungry baby, the widow who paid without being asked, the strange, sharp silence that had fallen over his store like something memorable trying to happen, that was somebody else's business entirely. He turned a page in his ledger. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. He showed up at 8 o'clock. He told himself the night before that he was only going to look, that he'd ride out to the North Ridge, get a clear sense of the property, ask a few direct questions, and make a rational decision based on what he found. He told himself this the way a man tells himself things he doesn't entirely believe while he's bundling a 7-month-old into every clean layer of clothing available and heating the last of the formula over a coal burner that was running on its final quarter-pound of fuel. The road to the North Ridge took 40 minutes on foot. Caleb didn't have a horse. He carried Noah in the sling Clara had sewn from canvas and old curtain fabric, a contraption that looked improvised because it was, but held the baby snug and warm against his chest. And he walked through 6 inches of overnight snow with his boots wrapped in an extra layer of burlap he'd tied off at the ankle. Because the left sole had been separating since September, and cold water coming in through a boot was the kind of problem that became a serious problem fast. He found the property without much difficulty. It sat at the end of a long dirt track lined with old cottonwood trees stripped bare by October, and the cottage was, well, it was exactly what she'd described, and not a syllable more flattering than that. The main structure was standing, which he supposed was the most optimistic thing you could say about it. The roof had a visible sag on the eastern side. Two of the front windows were boarded from the outside. The porch railing had given up at some point and lay in pieces along the front foundation, half buried in snow. Beyond the cottage, maybe 30 yards uphill, a larger, better-maintained house sat behind an iron fence, 2 stories, solid, a chimney already producing a thin thread of smoke into the gray morning sky. He was looking at the cottage, still working out the math of how bad it actually was, when the door to the larger house opened and Evelyn Ashcroft came down the path. She was dressed for working weather. That was the first thing he noticed, not because he'd expected otherwise exactly, but because the women he'd seen her standing near at Fitch's store, the ones in their good wool coats, had given him a picture of her world that didn't include practical boots and a coat with actual wear on the elbows. She carried a folder of papers under one arm, and she moved through the snow with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who'd been navigating difficult terrain her entire life and had stopped finding it inconvenient. "You came," she said. Not triumphant, just noting the fact. "I said I'd think about it." "You didn't say anything." She stopped a few feet away and looked at Noah, bundled in the sling, watching her with the wide-eyed gravity that babies applied to unfamiliar faces. "How old?" 7 months last week. She nodded once, looking at him the way you look at something fragile that is pretending it isn't. Then she shifted her attention to the cottage. "It's worse than it looks from the road." "I figured. The foundation is sound. I had a man look at it in the spring. The roof needs replacing on the east side, but maybe 60% of it, honestly. But the bones are good timber and they're not rotted through." She opened the folder and held out a hand-drawn diagram, which Caleb took. The small structure on the back, what used to be the laundry room, that's the piece that can be made livable fastest. New wood stove, patched walls. The window on the north side needs reglazing. Martha thinks 2 weeks, maybe 10 days if the weather holds. Caleb looked at the diagram. It was detailed. Someone had taken time on it. "You drew this yourself?" he asked. "I drew everything myself." There was no pride in it, just fact. Nobody else was going to. He handed it back. "What are the conditions?" "Of the arrangement." She looked at him steadily. "The work comes first. You rebuild the cottage. I'll cover materials, you provide the labor. I'll pay you a weekly wage while you're working. Fair market rate for a skilled laborer, which I've checked, and it's more than Dalton was paying before you ask." She paused. "When the main cottage is habitable, it's yours to live in. No rent while you're actively working the property. And if I stop working, then we renegotiate." She said it simply, without threat. "I'm not interested in trapping you here, Mr. Mercer. I need the work done. You need the work. If either of those things changes, we talk about it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cottage. He looked at his son's face, that small, serious face studying Evelyn Ashcroft with focused infant intensity. "You mentioned something yesterday, in the store, about the right to purchase." A brief silence. "I did," she said. "I want to understand that part." She closed the folder. When she spoke again, her voice was measured in a way that suggested she'd thought carefully about how to say this. "If you stay on this property and fulfill the terms of work for 3 years, completing the cottage, maintaining the land, the orchard, the fencing, I will sell you this property for $1, legal deed, your name on it. No conditions after that." Caleb stared at her. $1, he repeated. $1. Why? She looked out at the cottonwood trees. The smoke from her chimney drifted east. When she answered, she didn't look at him. "Because I have more land than I can use and more money than I need, and I've spent enough years watching both of those things do absolutely nothing for anyone." She turned back. "Including me." He wanted to press it. Something in him, the part that had learned not to take things at face value, the part that Clara had sometimes called his suspicious nature, and he'd preferred to call his reasonable caution, wanted to pull at the edges of that answer and see what was underneath it. But Noah chose that moment to make a decisive sound against his chest, the unmistakable pre-cry escalation that meant the discussion window was closing, and Caleb reached into his coat pocket for the formula tin. "Martha," Evelyn said, and turned toward the house. A woman appeared in the doorway of the larger house almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting just inside, which, Caleb would later discover, she almost always was. Martha Greer was somewhere in her mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair pinned back practically, and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that looked less like age and more like bedrock. She came down the path with a directness that matched Evelyn's, reached Caleb without introducing herself first, looked at Noah with the assessing eye of a woman who had pulled 4 children through infancy, and said, "He's hungry." "Yes, ma'am." "Give me that tin. I've got it warmed already." She said it the way you state a plan, not a request, and held out both hands. Caleb hesitated for only a second, just long enough to make it clear that the hesitation was intentional, that he wasn't a man who handed his son to strangers without a beat of deliberation. And then he unslung Noah and placed him in Martha Greer's arms. Martha held the baby with the automatic competence of long practice. Noah looked up at her face. She looked back at him. Some private negotiation occurred between them that took about 4 seconds, and then Noah grabbed the front of her coat with one fist and apparently decided she was acceptable. "Bottles inside," Martha said, already walking back toward the house. "Come in when you're ready. There's coffee." She was gone. Caleb watched the door close behind her, then turned to find Evelyn Ashcroft watching him with an expression that was very nearly amusement. "She's always like that," Evelyn said. "She's good with him. She's good with everyone. It's slightly annoying." He almost smiled. He caught himself. They walked the property together for the next hour. The collapsed fencing along the lower pasture, the orchard with its unpruned trees standing in tangled rows, the root cellar behind the cottage that had a good solid door and would serve well for storing what the land produced. Evelyn knew every corner of it. She pointed out drainage problems and structural advantages, and the spot near the eastern fence where underground water ran close to the surface, which she said made that section particularly useful in dry summers. She knew the soil composition. She knew which of the orchard trees were still viable and which ones were past saving. She'd clearly spent time here, not just as an owner touring her holdings, but as someone who'd looked closely at the land and thought seriously about what it could become. "You've been planning this for a while," Caleb said. She didn't answer immediately. They were standing at the edge of the orchard, looking up at the bare branches against a pale sky. "I've been thinking about it," she said finally. Thinking and planning aren't the same thing. "What changed?" She glanced at him sideways, just briefly. "I'm not sure yet." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was an honest one, and honest, incomplete answers were something Caleb had come to prefer over tidy explanations that didn't quite hold together, so he let it go, and they walked back to the house for the coffee Martha had promised. The coffee was strong and hot, and served without ceremony in plain ceramic mugs, and Caleb drank his standing up because it felt presumptuous to sit, until Martha looked at him from across the kitchen and said, "Sit down. You're making me tired watching you stand there being polite." And he sat down. Noah was in a low wooden chair padded with a folded blanket. Martha's improvisation, efficient and immediate, working on the formula bottle with serious concentration. He looked up once when Caleb sat down, seemed satisfied by what he found, and went back to the bottle. Caleb started work the following Monday. The first 2 weeks were the hardest kind of hard, the kind that doesn't announce itself as exceptional, just grinds on, daily and cold. He started before dawn and stopped when the light failed, which in late October meant working in darkness at both ends. The laundry room structure came together first, new wood stove hauled up from a supplier in town in pieces and assembled on site, walls rechinked where the wind was getting in, the north window reglazed with a sheet of glass that took 3 attempts to cut correctly, and 1 attempt that produced a crack he had to explain to nobody except himself. By the end of the second week, the space was heatable and windproof, and Caleb moved himself and Noah out of the one-room boarding house in Durango and into the small structure behind the cottage. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was theirs. Martha came down each morning and took Noah for the day while Caleb worked, and came back each evening and stayed until he'd finished and cleaned up and eaten something, because she'd apparently made a private decision in those first few days that feeding Caleb Mercer was part of her responsibilities, a decision nobody had discussed with him, but which he'd stopped arguing against by the end of the first week, because the food was good, and the arguing was exhausting, and he was too tired in the evenings to maintain principled positions about charity versus practical arrangements. He saw Evelyn most mornings. She came down to check on the work, ask questions, occasionally point out something he hadn't noticed. She didn't hover, and she didn't interfere, which he appreciated. What she did was pay attention, and the quality of her attention was different from what he was accustomed to. Not supervisory, not suspicious, just present. She looked at the work and she looked at him, and sometimes she asked a question that revealed she'd been thinking about whatever he was doing more carefully than he might have expected. One morning in mid-November, 3 weeks after he'd started, she came down earlier than usual and stood at the edge of the foundation where Caleb was repouring a cracked section and watched him work for a while before she said anything. "You didn't sleep last night," she said. He didn't look up from the pour. "I slept fine." "The light in your window was on until past 2. He did look up then. She was watching him with that level, unreadable expression, hands in her coat pockets. "Noah had a rough night," he said. "Teeth coming in. Martha said she'd take overnight shifts if you needed them." "I don't need them." A pause. "Why not?" He set down the tool he was using and straightened up, which took a moment longer than it should have because his back had been giving him trouble for a week, and he was too stubborn to mention it. "Because he's my son. Rough nights are part of having a son." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're very determined to do everything the hard way." "I'm determined to do it the right way." "Those aren't the same thing." She considered that. "Sometimes they are." "Sometimes," he agreed. "Not always." Something shifted in the air between them. Not dramatic, not the kind of shift you could point to. Just a small recalibration, like two compasses settling toward the same north. Evelyn looked away first, toward the upper pasture, and said, "The fencing supplier in town is overcharging on post iron. I found a man in Silverton who does better quality at 2/3 the price. I'll make the introduction if you want. I'd appreciate that." She nodded and walked back toward the house. Caleb watched her go. He went back to his work. But something had changed, and he knew it, and he spent the rest of that morning refusing to think about what it was. The talk started in December. He knew it was coming. He'd have been naive not to. Durango in 1888 was a city that was growing fast and had not yet developed the social sophistication to mind its own business with any consistency, and the image of Evelyn Ashcroft, the Ashcroft widow, as people called her, the woman whose late husband's cattle empire was the foundation of a significant portion of the territory's economy, spending time on a remote property with a penniless widower was not an image that the town's social architecture was built to ignore. The first thing he heard was from a supply merchant in town he'd gone to pick up lumber from. The man made a comment, oblique with a smirk that he didn't bother to hide entirely, about Caleb's arrangement on the ridge and whether the work involved was entirely of the structural variety. Caleb loaded his lumber without responding. He drove the wagon back to the property and unloaded it, and spent about 20 minutes after dinner in the small room, sitting in the chair beside Noah's crib, working through the particular controlled anger of a man who knows the correct response is silence, but finds silence very expensive. He told Evelyn the following morning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Who was it?" "Doesn't matter." "It doesn't," she agreed, "but I'm curious." "Hollis, the lumberman." "I've bought materials from Hollis for 11 years. She said it without particular emotion. "He'll think twice." "Mrs. Ashcroft, I'm not going to have a confrontation with him if that's what concerns you. I'm simply going to take my business to Patterson's yard on the north end. Hollis will notice the absence. Men like that always do." Caleb looked at her. "You shouldn't have to change your business because of gossip about me." "I'm not changing it because of gossip. I'm changing it because I don't do business with men who speak that way about people in my employ." She met his eyes. "Which is a distinction that matters to me, even if it doesn't matter to anyone else." It was that sentence, not the action, but the explanation that stuck with him. He was thinking about it 3 days later when Victor Langley's carriage appeared on the road to the North Ridge. He'd seen Langley twice before, both times at a distance. Once on the main street in Durango, once at the edge of a public land auction Caleb had attended 6 months before the mine closed, when he'd still been trying to think about the future in practical terms. Victor Langley was 40-something, broad in the shoulder, with the look of a man who had never once in his life been physically uncomfortable without doing something immediately to correct the situation. He ran land operations that stretched across 3 counties, owned 2 banks he did not officially own, and had the particular social fluency of men who had always moved in circles where being liked and being feared were not mutually exclusive. He didn't get out of the carriage. He stopped it on the road beside the property line and called out to Caleb, who was working on the fence posts along the lower pasture. "Mercer." Caleb kept working. He finished driving the post he was on and then straightened up and turned around, but he didn't walk toward the carriage. "Mr. Langley," he said. Langley leaned out the window. He was smiling the way powerful men smile at people they're about to be reasonable with. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I've been meaning to come up for a few weeks, but the season's kept me busy." "I know who you are?" "Good. Saves time." Langley looked around the property with an expression of mild assessment. "You've done some work up here." "Some." "Mrs. Ashcroft keeping you busy?" The question had a texture to it that wasn't accidental. Caleb looked at him steadily and didn't answer. Langley adjusted the smile. "I'll be direct, Mercer. I respect your time. I've had an interest in this parcel for going on 4 years. Mrs. Ashcroft has declined to discuss it, which is her right. But the situation has become somewhat more complicated now that there are, let's say, personal elements involved that may be clouding the picture." "What situation?" Caleb asked. "The situation where you're living on her property under an arrangement that no one in this county fully understands and half the town is talking about." The smile was gone now. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for you, son. I'm trying to explain to you that you've put yourself in a position that is going to be very difficult to hold. There are people in this territory, men of influence, men with legal resources, who take an interest in how widows manage their estates, particularly when outside parties appear and arrangements are made that might not withstand scrutiny." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "Are you threatening her?" he asked. "I'm informing you," Langley said. "As a courtesy." "A courtesy." Caleb walked 3 steps toward the carriage, which was close enough that Langley's driver shifted slightly in his seat. He kept his voice level. "Then let me extend one back. Mrs. Ashcroft makes her own decisions. I work for her. That's the whole of the arrangement. Whatever people are saying, and whatever interest you have in this land is a matter between you and her. Not you and me." Langley studied him. Something moved behind the man's eyes that was neither the smile nor the information delivery. Something older and less civilized than either of those. "You seem like a reasonable man," Langley said. "I'm a working man," Caleb said. "Which right now means I need to get back to my fence posts." He turned around and went back to work. The carriage stayed on the road for another minute. He didn't turn to watch it leave. He just kept driving posts, steady and even, one after another, until he heard the wheels finally begin to move away. That evening, Evelyn came down to the cottage, not for the morning walk, not at the regular time, but after supper, which was unusual. She knocked at the door of the small structure, and when Caleb opened it, she was holding 2 cups of coffee, and she said, "Langley came to the house this afternoon." "He came here first," Caleb said. She handed him one of the cups. "Come outside. I'd rather not have this conversation where the walls are thin." They sat on the front step of the cottage, which was still more construction site than entrance. The porch reconstruction barely started. In the cold dark with their coffee, and Evelyn told him what Langley had said to her, which was considerably more than what he'd said to Caleb. There were legal insinuations about the terms of her late husband's estate. There was language about the responsibilities of a trustworthy stewardship of Ashcroft Holdings. There was, carefully wrapped in procedural concern, a suggestion that the arrangement with Caleb represented a vulnerability in how she managed the estate, a vulnerability that certain parties might feel obligated to raise with the territory's court. "He can't actually do anything," she said. The estate is fully mine, has been for 7 years. The legal standing is not in question. A pause. But he can make the process of doing anything expensive, time, lawyers, public attention. She looked out at the dark field. He's done it before to other people. To get land. Always to get land. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He's wanted this parcel since Robert died. It sits between two of his operations, and it would allow him to close a gap that currently costs him considerably in logistics. Caleb thought about this. What do you want to do? She turned to look at him. In the dark, her expression was harder to read than usual. I want to continue exactly as planned, even if he follows through on the legal pressure. Especially then. Something in her voice had hardened, but not in the brittle way. In the way that stone is hard, that has been under pressure long enough to become something that doesn't break. I've spent 20 years in this territory doing what I was expected to do and managing my holdings the way people expected a woman in my position to manage them. And I have never once made a decision I was proud of specifically because someone else told me I had to. She paused. I'm not starting now because Victor Langley wants my fence line. Caleb looked at her. The coffee had gone mostly cold in his cup. All right, he said. All right, she repeated. A ghost of something, not a smile, but the shape of one, crossed her face. Get some sleep, Mr. Mercer. You've got the south fence section tomorrow. I know. She stood up, took her cup, and walked back toward the house. He sat there for a while after she left. The night was very clear and very cold, the kind of cold that had weight to it, and above the ridge the stars were doing what they always did. Indifferent and brilliant, the same stars that had been there every other night of his life, looking no different for everything that had changed beneath them. He finished the cold coffee. He went inside. Noah was asleep in his crib, bundled in the good blanket Martha had brought down from the main house. Heavy wool, good quality. His face peaceful and round and entirely unconcerned with Victor Langley or property lines or the things people said in town. Caleb sat on the edge of his cot and looked at his son for a long time. He thought about the store, about Fitch's hand outstretched, flat and contemptuous, and the sound the tin had made when it hit the counter. He thought about 8 months of mornings waking up beside Clara's empty side of the bed and telling himself it was going to get better because you had to tell yourself something. He thought about the moment on the wooden boardwalk outside Fitch's store when he'd stood in the cold with 2 wrapped tins in his arms and felt, for just one unguarded second, like something in the world had shifted. He'd spent 3 weeks since then trying to figure out if that feeling was something he could trust. He was still trying. He pulled off his boots and lay down on the cot with his coat over him because the fire was burning low, and he was too tired to stoke it properly, and he listened to his son breathe in the dark, and outside the wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees along the drive with a sound like something being slowly let go. He was asleep before he finished the thought. In the larger house on the hill, a light stayed on in the second-floor window for another 2 hours, and the woman behind it sat at her desk and wrote letters she didn't send, and stared at diagrams she'd already memorized, and tried very hard to identify the precise moment in the last 3 weeks when she had stopped thinking about this as an arrangement and started thinking about it as something she couldn't easily name and was not entirely sure she wanted to. She couldn't find it. She turned the lamp down at last and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the wind, and then she went to bed. Outside, the cottonwood trees went on moving in the cold night air, indifferent to the particular difficulties of human beings trying to figure out what they owe each other, and what they're allowed to want, and which of those two things is more dangerous to get wrong. The announcement happened on a Tuesday. Caleb didn't know it was coming. That was the part he kept returning to afterward. Not what Evelyn said, not the crowd's reaction, not even Langley's face when she said it, but the simple fact that she hadn't told him, that she had made a decision of that magnitude, a decision that would reorder both of their lives and every relationship she'd spent decades building in this territory. And she had not mentioned it to him the night before, or the morning of, or at any point in the preceding week, when he'd been right there, 20 yards from her front door, working in the cold. He found out the same way everybody else did. The occasion was the Durango Merchants' Winter Assembly, held the second Tuesday of December in the main hall above the bank on Reyes Street. Evelyn had attended every year for the better part of 2 decades, first beside her husband Robert, and then alone after his death, and her presence was considered one of the reliable fixtures of the event. The Ashcroft name on the attendee list was the kind of social confirmation that made other people feel the gathering was legitimate. Caleb had not been invited and had no reason to attend and was, at the time the assembly began, on his knees in the main cottage, pulling up warped floorboards in the front room. Martha came to get him just after 7. She appeared in the cottage doorway with her coat half-buttoned and a look on her face that Caleb had not seen before. Not alarmed exactly, but altered, the expression of someone who has received news that requires a different mental gear than the one they were running in. "You need to come to town," she said. He looked up from the floor. "What happened?" "Mrs. Ashcroft is at the assembly hall." Martha paused, which was not something she did often. "She's made a public announcement." He waited. "About you," Martha said, "and the property, and some other things." Another pause. "You should hear it yourself." He pulled on his coat, and they drove into Durango in the dark in Martha's wagon, Noah bundled between them under a wool blanket, and Caleb spent the 40 minutes of that drive running through what the announcement might be. He thought about the lease. He thought about Langley. He thought about the conversation on the cottage step 2 weeks ago when Evelyn had said she intended to continue exactly as planned, and the way she'd said it, not bravely, not with the self-conscious delivery of someone performing resolve, but with a flatness that meant the decision was already settled and the only question remaining was execution. He should have known then that execution, for Evelyn Ashcroft, meant something more than quietly holding her ground. The assembly hall was still full when they arrived. The formal portion of the evening was over. He could tell from the noise coming through the doors, the particular mixed register sound of a crowd that has moved past structured proceedings into something more ungoverned. Martha stayed outside with Noah, and Caleb went in alone. The room was warm and lamplit and packed with the territory's commercial class: merchants, suppliers, 2 bank officers, the owner of the largest freighting operation west of the pass, assorted wives and associates arranged along the perimeter. There was a raised platform at the front of the room with a lectern that now stood empty. And in the middle of the room, surrounded by a loose constellation of people in various states of reaction, stood Evelyn. She was not holding court. She was not performing. She was having what appeared to be a very controlled conversation with a man Caleb recognized as Harrison Webb, who ran the largest dry goods operation in 3 counties, and who was currently speaking with the careful emphasis of a man trying very hard to remain civil while conveying deep personal offense. "Cannot simply make these decisions unilaterally, Evelyn. The implications for how the community perceives— I've made decisions unilaterally for 20 years, Harrison." She was looking at him with the patient steadiness of someone waiting for a sentence to end. "You've never found it objectionable before. This is different. How?" Webb didn't answer immediately, which told Caleb that the honest answer was something Webb didn't want to say out loud in company. Caleb scanned the room. He found what he was looking for near the far wall. 2 men he didn't know personally, but recognized from Langley's carriage visit in November, associates of some kind, watching the room with the detached professional attention of people who were here to observe rather than participate. Langley himself was not present, which felt deliberate. Someone near the door recognized Caleb, and the whisper went through the room like water finding level. Heads turned. Evelyn looked across the crowd and found him, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not apology, something harder to name. Acknowledgement, maybe. The look of a person who has done a difficult thing and is now watching the person most affected by it arrive to find out what they did. He made his way through the crowd toward her. People moved aside, not hostilely, but with the particular social delicacy of people who aren't sure yet which way this is going and don't want to be standing in the wrong place when it resolves. "Mr. Mercer." Her voice was even. "Mrs. Ashcroft." He stopped in front of her. He kept his voice low. "What did you do?" She looked at him with that level gaze. "I protected the arrangement. By announcing it publicly. By putting it beyond reach." She glanced briefly at Webb, then back. "Langley filed a legal inquiry with the Territorial Administrator's office last week, challenging the terms of the estate on grounds of improper management, which is a mechanism he's used before and which takes approximately 8 months and considerable money to resolve, even when the outcome is never in question. She paused. Unless the arrangement in question is already a matter of public legal record and community knowledge, at which point the political cost of pursuing it becomes higher than the benefit. Caleb looked at her. "You turned it into a public record," he said. "I filed the lease agreement with the county clerk yesterday morning, and tonight I announced the terms to the assembly." She didn't blink. "The lease is protected. The purchase option is on record. There is nothing Langley can challenge now without challenging a documented legal arrangement that has been publicly witnessed by 47 members of this community's commercial class." A pause. "Including 2 men who sit on the Territorial Administrators Advisory Council." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have told me," he said. "I could have." She held his gaze. "I didn't want to give you the opportunity to talk me out of it." The honest directness of that landed somewhere in his chest in a way that he didn't have immediate access to the right response for. Webb, who had been standing at the edge of this exchange, with the barely contained energy of a man with unfinished objections, chose this moment to reinsert himself. "Evelyn, I'm going to say plainly what others are too polite to say. What you've done tonight, the lease, the purchase option, this..." He gestured vaguely at Caleb in a way that managed to be offensive without technically being a word. "Arrangement. People are going to talk. People are already talking. This affects the reputation of your house, your husband's legacy." "Robert's been dead for 7 years, Evelyn said. "His legacy is not my responsibility to curate at the cost of my own decisions." "The school," said a woman's voice from somewhere to the left, and the crowd shifted. Caleb turned. A woman he didn't know, 50s, sharp-faced, expensive coat, was addressing the room rather than Evelyn specifically. "She also announced a school," the woman said to the people around her, with the tight-lipped delivery of someone reporting a casualty, "for the railroad workers' families, and a nursery." "I heard," said someone else. "The capital she's committing? It's her capital," said a third voice, younger, from the back of the room, and there was a brief silence in which that sentence reorganized the room's atmosphere very slightly. Evelyn didn't look at any of them. She was looking at Caleb, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been trying to read since the morning in October when she'd handed back that diagram and said, "Thinking and planning aren't the same thing." He was getting better at reading it. It meant she was waiting for a verdict, and she was not certain of the outcome. And she was not going to let that uncertainty show any further than what was already visible. "The school," he said. "There are 43 children of railroad workers in this county who have no schooling past the age of 8, she said. "The nursery means their mothers can work without leaving infants unattended. I've had the plans drawn for a year." She paused. "The cottage arrangement gave me the reason to do it now, rather than continuing to think about doing it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You used me as cover," he said. Not angrily, just placing it on the table. "I used the situation as an occasion," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes." She didn't elaborate, she just held his gaze and waited. He turned and looked at the room, at Webb's offended stillness, at the women in their good coats, at the 2 Langley associates by the wall who were now having a quiet conversation with each other, at the younger voice in the back who'd said, "It's her capital," and was now looking at his boots with the satisfaction of someone who'd said the right thing and wasn't sure yet if they'd be thanked for it. "All right," Caleb said. "All right what?" "All right, it's different." He looked back at her. "But you still should have told me." Something released in her face, just slightly. The set of her jaw changed by a fraction. "Yes," she said. "I should have." That was all. But it was the first time he'd heard her concede anything, and it meant more than whatever she might have said if she'd tried to explain it further. The crowd around them began to disperse, slowly, with the reluctant drift of people who'd wanted a scene and were getting instead the anticlimax of 2 people having a reasonable conversation in moderate tones. Webb said something else to Evelyn about the wisdom of consultation and the importance of considering the optics of major decisions, and Evelyn listened to him with the polite attention of someone who has already made all the relevant choices and is now simply waiting for the objection to finish. Caleb left before Webb did. He went back outside where Martha and Noah were waiting in the cold, and he stood beside the wagon for a minute saying nothing, and Martha looked at him and said, "Well?" "She announced everything publicly," he said. "I know. I talked to someone coming out." Martha repositioned Noah in her arms. The baby was awake now, looking at the lamplight from the hall windows with the absorbed attention he gave to all illuminated things. "What are you going to do?" Caleb looked up at the sky. Clear night, more stars than the town's lamps could compete with. "Keep working," he said. Martha made the sound she made when she thought someone was being deliberately obtuse, but had decided not to push it. They drove back to the ridge in the cold dark. The consequences came in January, which in Caleb's experience was when consequences generally arrived, after the initial noise had settled and the people with actual power had finished their holiday entertainments and gotten back to the business of making things difficult. The first was the bank. Thomas Reed, who managed the Durango Territorial Savings and handled the operating accounts for the Ashcroft Holdings, sent a letter in the second week of January informing Evelyn that given recent developments and certain concerns among the institution's directors regarding estate management, he would be recommending a review of the lending arrangements currently extended to her commercial operations. The language was bureaucratic and careful and meant, when translated, that the bank was considering making her financing more expensive and more difficult as a mechanism of social pressure. Evelyn read the letter at the kitchen table with her coffee and then folded it and set it aside with the same expression she applied to most bad news, which was the look of someone filing information in the correct mental location without spending additional energy on it. "Can they do it?" Caleb asked. He'd started taking his morning coffee in the main house kitchen by December, not by design, but because Martha had started making enough for 3, and it was cold in the cottage before the stove got going, and the arrangement had simply persisted. "Technically, yes," she said. "Practically, it will cost them more than it costs me. 2 of my accounts alone represent— It doesn't matter. The number is large." She picked up her cup. "Reed is performing discomfort for the benefit of people who've asked him to perform it. He'll settle. And if he doesn't? Then I'll find a bank in Denver that isn't interested in managing my personal choices alongside my deposits." Caleb looked at her over his cup. "You're very calm about this." "I'm very tired," she said, with a frankness that surprised him. "Which looks like calm from outside." She set down the cup. "I've been managing other people's reactions to my decisions since Robert died, and in some cases before that. I have a limited amount of energy for it, and I've learned to spend it on the decisions themselves rather than worrying about the reactions." He wanted to say something to that, but couldn't locate the right sentence. He understood it. Understood it at a cellular level, actually, the way you understand things that have been true in your own life before you had the vocabulary for them. The year after Clara's death had been full of people managing their reactions to his grief, to his choices, to his refusal to accept certain kinds of help, and his acceptance of others. He'd made peace with being someone other people had opinions about. What he was still working out was whether it bothered him that now Evelyn was in that position partly because of him. He went back to work. The cottage main structure was coming together. The new roof section was done, the framing on the east side replaced, the windows reglazed and properly fitted. What remained was interior work. And interior work in winter was different from the outdoor labor of the fall. Slower, more detailed, requiring a different kind of attention. He was rehanging the front door one morning in late January when he heard a wagon on the road and looked up to see a vehicle he didn't recognize stopping at the property line. 3 men got out. They were well dressed for field work, which meant they weren't there for field work. One of them had a document case under his arm. Caleb put down the door hinge he was working with and walked to the fence line. "Help you?" he said. The one with the document case introduced himself as a surveyor's assistant from the county office, accompanying 2 representatives of the Langley Land and Cattle Company who wished to conduct a boundary verification of the Ashcroft North Ridge parcel in accordance with a request filed with the county assessor. "A request filed by who?" Caleb asked. "The request was filed by the Langley Company," the man said. "It's a standard procedure when there are questions about the documented boundaries of—" "There aren't questions," Caleb said. "The boundaries are recorded. Have been for 20 years. Nevertheless, the man said, with the apologetic blankness of someone delivering a message they didn't write, the assessment has been requested and approved, and we're authorized to conduct it. Caleb looked at the two Langley men. They looked back at him with the professional blankness of people paid to stand somewhere and not explain themselves. Then conduct it, Caleb said. From the road. You don't have right of access to the property without Mrs. Ashcroft's permission, and she hasn't given it. Mr. Mercer, you know who I am? A pause. The company is aware of who you are, the Langley man on the left said. Good. Then you also know she's up at the main house, and you're welcome to ask her directly. He picked up the door hinge again. I'll be here. They conferred quietly among themselves. Then they drove the wagon up the track to the main house. Caleb watched them go and then went back to the door. 20 minutes later, Evelyn appeared at the top of the track and walked down without her coat, which meant she'd come out quickly. They've left, she said. What did they say? Langley is claiming there's a discrepancy in the northeast boundary that may affect the property's legal description in the lease. She stopped beside him. Her breath was visible in the cold air. There is no discrepancy. The claim is fabricated to give him grounds to contest the lease filing in court. Caleb set down the hinge for the second time that morning. What do you need? She looked at him for a moment. It was the question, he realized. Not the practical question, but the fact of it, the way he'd asked it. What do you need? Not what are you going to do? Not what should I do? Not this is getting complicated and I want you to know I'm not the cause of it. Just, what do you need? My lawyer is in Denver, she said. I need to send him a letter today, and I may need to go to Denver next week. I can manage the property. I know you can. She paused. There's something else. He waited. Langley's going to increase the pressure before the court process starts. That's how he works. He makes things uncomfortable enough that the legal process looks like relief by comparison, a way to settle things cleanly. He'll make approaches to suppliers. He may make things difficult for Martha's husband, who has business relationships in town. Her voice was steady, but had that quality of stone under pressure again. I want you to know what's coming, so it doesn't come as a surprise. It won't, Caleb said. I knew who Langley was when he pulled up on the road in November. And I told you then. Your fence line, your decision, nothing's changed. She was quiet for a moment in a way that felt different from her usual silences. More open somehow, less armored. You could leave, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. The legal arrangement protects you on paper, but Langley could make the practical reality of staying here difficult in ways that… Mrs. Ashcroft. He said it quietly, but it stopped her. I grew up in a company mining town in Nevada. My father worked for men like Langley for 30 years, and I watched what that does. I know what men like that look like, and I know what they do, and I know the two things they cannot tolerate. He looked at her. People who don't need them, and people who aren't afraid of them. A long pause. Which are you? She asked. Both, he said. On a good day. Something in her face moved. Not the fraction of a smile from before. Something more substantial than that, something she didn't cover quickly enough. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, and he was not certain he was, a great deal like the specific kind of relief that comes not from a problem being solved, but from a person being exactly what you hoped they were. She recovered herself, looked at the door he was rehanging. Is the frame level? He glanced at it. Almost. There's a slight angle on the east jamb. He looked again. She was right. You have a good eye. I have a good eye for things that aren't straight, she said, and there was the very faint shape of something wry in it, barely there. She picked up her coat collar against the wind. I'll send the letter to Denver today. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. She walked back up to the house. Caleb stood at the door for a long moment after she'd gone, the hinge cold in his hand, the wind coming down off the ridge with the particular edge it got in January. And he thought about the assembly hall and the folded bank letter and the Langley men on the road, and he tried to build an honest accounting of the situation. The honest accounting was this. He had shown up in October with 4 cents and a baby and exactly no plan beyond not surrendering. And now it was January, and he had a roof and work, and a legal right to property, and a son who was learning to pull himself upright against the leg of Martha's kitchen table. And on the other side of that ledger was a powerful man with lawyers and money and two banks he didn't officially own, who had decided that Caleb Mercer and Evelyn Ashcroft were a problem that needed resolving. The question was not whether Caleb was frightened of Langley. He was. He knew how this kind of power worked, knew what it could do to ordinary people who didn't have the resources to sustain a legal fight or the connections to absorb economic pressure. He'd seen men broken by smaller forces than Victor Langley. The question was what he was going to do with the fear. He looked at the door, found the east jamb, adjusted the hinge by a quarter inch and tested the swing and found the movement clean and even, the door settling into its frame with the quiet solidity of a thing that has been put right. He drove the pin. Inside the main house, a lamp came on in the study window and stayed on through the dinner hour and into the evening. And Caleb, eating in the cottage with Noah practicing his new standing trick against the table leg, looked up at that lit window once and thought about a woman writing letters in Denver with the same careful attention she brought to boundary surveys and orchard assessments and the specific angle of a door jamb that wasn't quite level. Noah fell down, sat for a moment with an expression of genuine surprise, and then grabbed the table leg and pulled himself up again. Caleb watched him. "Yeah," he said, to his son or to the lit window or to no one in particular. "That's about the size of it." The snow came hard the following week. Not the blizzard, that was still a month away, still building itself out in the northern ranges, accumulating the particular depth and velocity that would eventually change everything, but a serious snow, 2 feet in 36 hours, the kind that clarified things. It closed the road to Durango for 4 days. It killed 3 of the fence posts Caleb had driven along the east boundary, and he had to dig them out and reset them in frozen ground. It brought down a section of the cottage's new roof. Not the section he'd rebuilt. The other section, the part he'd assessed in November and marked as marginal, which turned out to have been a generous assessment. He was on the roof in the second day of the snow, in weather a reasonable man would have called unsuitable for roof work, trying to get a tarp secured over the failed section before the interior took more water damage, when he heard someone calling from below. He looked down. Evelyn was standing in the snow below the roofline, holding one end of the rope he'd thrown down to stabilize the tarp. She had hold of it with both hands, and her boots were sunk 6 inches into the snowpack, and she was looking up at him with the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and made a decision and is not currently interested in discussing whether the decision was advisable. "You didn't have to," he started. "The tarp is moving," she said. "Tell me when." He worked for 20 minutes on the roof in heavy snow, with Evelyn holding the rope below, and the arrangement was awkward and imperfect, and the tarp got secured in a way that would hold for now and need proper attention when the weather broke. And when he climbed down the ladder, his hands were stiff, and his back was worse than it had been, and there was a split in the knee of his work pants where he'd caught it on a nail. She handed him the rope. They were standing very close in the narrow space between the ladder and the cottage wall, closer than they'd ever stood before, both of them cold and wet and breathing hard from the effort. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. Snow on her coat, on her hair, her cheeks red from the cold. "The tarp needs permanent repair," she said, "when the weather breaks." "I know. I have a contact in town who does roofing work. I can ask him to." "I'll do it." "You can't do everything." "I can do the roof." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated. Several things at once, some of them contradicting each other, none of them easy to name. "You are," she said finally, "the most stubborn person I have met in 46 years of meeting people." "I've been told," he said. "By who?" "My wife." The word came out without premeditation, the way some things do, after enough time. "She said it was both my best and worst quality depending on the day." A silence. The snow came down between them, quiet and indifferent. "She was right," Evelyn said. Her voice had changed slightly, softer without being gentle, careful with the word. "She sounds like she was a perceptive person." "She was," Caleb said, "the most perceptive person I've ever known." He paused. "Until recently." He hadn't planned to say that either. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read her expression, and he stopped trying. He just stood there in the snow and let the sentence be what it was. She turned and walked back toward the main house without responding. He watched her go. He stood there in the falling snow for a while afterward, not moving, the rope in his hands, the cold settling into his wet coat, and he tried to decide whether he'd said the right thing or made a significant error. He couldn't tell. He went inside and changed his shirt and stooped by Noah's crib, where the baby was sleeping through all of it, as babies sleep through the complicated things, soundly and without apology. And Caleb sat beside him in the cold cottage and listened to the snow and thought about perceptive women and the particular loneliness of being known by someone who was no longer there, and the stranger, newer loneliness of starting to be known again and not being certain it was safe. The snow kept falling. On the north ridge, covered in white and cold and the accumulated weight of a Colorado winter that wasn't finished yet, the cottage stood with its temporary tarp and its newly hung door and its repaired roof and its marginal section that still needed attention. Not finished, not perfect, but solid enough to hold against what had come so far. It was, Caleb thought, a reasonable description of several things. The sentence stayed with her longer than she wanted it to, until recently. 2 words, set in the snow beside a ladder in weather that had no business being worked in, by a man whose hands were split at the knuckles from cold, and whose coat was soaked through, and who had been on a roof in a blizzard because the alternative was letting something he'd built get ruined. 2 words said without performance, without the careful social engineering of a man trying to make an impression. Said the way people say things when they're tired and cold, and have stopped managing the distance between what they think and what they say. Evelyn had spent a week not thinking about it. She was not entirely successful. She wrote to her lawyer in Denver and received a thorough and somewhat grim assessment of Langley's legal options, which were fewer than the man wanted and more than she would have preferred. She corresponded with a contractor about the school site. The land was already hers, a flat parcel at the edge of the railroad workers' district that she'd purchased 2 years ago with this exact use in mind, before she told anyone, including herself, that she was actually going to do it. She sat across from Thomas Reed at the bank and listened to him explain, with the apologetic precision of a man caught between 2 forces, neither of which he fully controlled, that the lending review was being pursued and would likely result in adjusted terms on 2 of her operating accounts. She thanked him for his transparency and told him she'd be in touch after consulting with her Denver contacts, by which she meant she'd be in touch after she'd identified alternative financing arrangements sufficient to make the bank's adjusted terms irrelevant, which was a process she had already begun. She did all of this with the functioning competence that had kept the Ashcroft holdings intact through 7 years of widowhood and 3 years of drought, and 1 sustained campaign by a neighboring operation that had tried to encroach on her southern water rights and ultimately failed. She was not a woman who fell apart. She had never been that woman. She had sometimes, privately, wondered what it would feel like to be that woman, to have the option of falling apart, to have someone nearby who could absorb the collapse. Robert had provided that, in his way, though he was not a man given to emotional vocabulary. His version of support was practical. He fixed things, he made calls, he arrived with resources when resources were needed. She had not realized until he was gone exactly how much she had relied on the simple architecture of someone else's presence, the way it made the difficult things feel negotiable rather than absolute. She was thinking about this, not about Caleb specifically, but about presence, about the way the main house had felt for the past 3 months compared to how it had felt for the 7 years before that. When Martha appeared in the study doorway and said, "His boy took 3 steps today," Evelyn looked up from her papers. "Unassisted," Martha said. "Fell down after, but 3 full steps." She paused, with the barely contained satisfaction of someone who has witnessed something important. "He's going to be walking by spring." Evelyn set down her pen. "Does Caleb know?" "He was in the upper pasture. I'm saving it." Martha leaned against the doorframe. "He's going to lose his mind." Evelyn looked back at her papers, then back at Martha. Martha was watching her with the particular expression she used when she was not going to say something but wanted it known that she had something to say. "What?" Evelyn said. "Nothing," Martha said. "Martha, I'm just standing here. You're standing here the way you stand when you have an opinion you've decided I need to receive indirectly." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then, "He fixed the east fence post today, the one the snow took down twice. He dug down a foot deeper and reseeded it in gravel pack so it won't heave again. Spent the better part of 3 hours on one fence post. She paused. In February. I know. He also rehung the root cellar door, which nobody asked him to because he noticed it was binding on the left side and figured out it would freeze shut in another hard, cold snap. Another pause. Nobody asked him to notice that either. Martha. I'm just observing. You are absolutely not just observing. Martha pushed off the doorframe with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has made her point and doesn't need to underline it. Coffee's on, she said, and left. Evelyn sat alone in the study. Outside the window, the February light was doing the thing it did in late winter, flatter than January's light, less sharp, carrying in it the first faint suggestion that the angle of the sun was changing even though the cold said otherwise. On the north pasture, barely visible from the study window, a figure moved along the fence line, methodical and unhurried, checking what needed checking, fixing what could be fixed. She turned back to her papers. She was not very productive for the rest of that afternoon. The break in the weather came the second week of February, 4 days of temperatures that climbed almost to reasonable, and Caleb used every hour of it. He finished the cottage roof, not just the tarp section, the full east side, pulling up the marginal boards he'd flagged in November and replacing them properly, a job that took 2.5 days and went faster than expected, because on the second morning Evelyn appeared with the second hammer and climbed the ladder without being invited, and worked the far section while he worked the near one. He didn't comment on this. She didn't explain it. They worked in the easy silence of people who had gotten past the stage of needing to narrate their cooperation. On the evening the roof was finished, they sat on the completed porch, the rebuilt porch, with proper railing, which had been done in January during a dry spell, and Caleb told her what he was thinking about for the orchard. The 3 trees on the northeast corner are past saving, he said. The root systems are too damaged, but if I take them out and turn the soil this spring, there's room for 6 new trees and the air circulation would improve for the ones that are left. He'd been thinking about this for weeks, had read everything he could find on orchard management, had borrowed a book from the Durango Library on Colorado stone fruit cultivation that Martha had picked up for him on a supply run. The variety mix is wrong too. Too many of the same type maturing at the same time. Better to have 3 varieties across a longer season. Evelyn was looking at the dark shape of the orchard against the last light. Robert planted those trees, she said. The northeast corner ones. A pause. I didn't know that, Caleb said. They were always marginal. He knew it when he planted them. Wrong exposure, wrong soil depth. He planted them anyway because he wanted an orchard, and he wasn't patient about waiting for the right location. She paused. He was not a patient man. I can leave them, Caleb said. Find another way to address the air circulation. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. Take them out. He would have done it himself by now if he'd been here to watch them fail for 3 years. A brief pause. He was not sentimental about things that didn't work. Was he sentimental about things that did? She looked over at him. There was still enough light to see her face. In his way, she said. He didn't talk about it. But, yes. She looked back at the orchard. He was. They sat for a while without speaking. Noah's voice came from inside the cottage. Not crying, that particular running commentary babies make when they've found something interesting, a sound like someone working through a complicated problem in a language they invented themselves. Martha's laugh followed, low and warm. Can I ask you something? Caleb said. You can ask. The child you lost. He stopped, rechecked his approach. I heard it mentioned, in town, earlier. I don't know the details and I'm not asking for them. I want to understand something. She was still, the kind of still that isn't stillness, but the absence of permission to move yet. What do you want to understand? She said. The house, he said. The main house. It's a good house. It's clearly been a good house, but there's something about it that's been bothering me since October, and I couldn't name it until about a month ago. He picked his next words carefully. It's set up for more people than live there. Not just more than you and Martha and her husband. The proportions of it, the way the rooms are arranged. It was built for a family. A long silence. Her name was Catherine, Evelyn said. Her voice was level. She was 4 years old. She didn't continue immediately, and Caleb didn't prompt her. Fever, 1869, the same fever that went through most of the mining families that year. But we weren't a mining family, and we had doctors, and we had resources, and none of it— She stopped, started again. None of it made any difference in the end. Caleb didn't say he was sorry. He'd been on the receiving end of "I'm sorry" enough times to know that it was a sentence people said because they didn't have another one, and it didn't help. Robert built the house the year after, she said. I think he thought— I don't know what he thought— that building something big enough would fill the space, or at least make the space useful. She paused. It didn't. No, Caleb said. I don't think that's how it works. How would you know? The question wasn't hostile, genuinely curious. Because I spent 8 months after Clara died rearranging the furniture in our room, he said, trying to make the space make sense, kept moving things, never found the arrangement that fixed it. He looked down at his hands. Eventually I stopped trying to fix the space and just lived in it, crooked. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Crooked, she repeated. Functional, but crooked. Yeah. Another silence, longer this time. The school plans, she said at last, shifting, the way people shift when they've been somewhere vulnerable longer than they're comfortable with. I need a site manager once construction starts in the spring, someone the workers will take direction from without requiring a woman to be present every day to enforce it. She glanced at him sideways. I know you have the cottage work, but the school site is only 2 miles from here in the morning hours. I can do it, he said. I haven't told you the scope yet. Tell me. She did. It was significant. Not just the school building, but the adjacent nursery structure, a covered well, a basic supply room that would eventually serve both buildings. She'd been thorough with the plans, as she was thorough with everything, and as she talked, he could hear the years of thinking behind it, the careful accumulation of what was needed and what was possible and how to bridge the two. When she finished, he said, What made you want to do this? The school. Not the convenient explanation you gave at the assembly, the real one. She looked at him. I had a teacher, she said after a moment, before we came west, in Ohio, when I was 9 years old. A woman named Mrs. Garrity, who had a one-room school for 30 children and who taught every one of us like our futures were worth investing in. She paused. I think about her approximately once a week. I have for 40 years. A brief quiet. Nobody should have to get to 40 years old before they think about doing what she did. He nodded slowly. Then it's a good reason, he said. She stood up. The cold had deepened as they'd talked, the brief warmth of the day now fully retreated. Get some sleep, Caleb. She said his name. First time, just his name, without the mister, without the buffer of the formal address. She said it like it was a word she'd been using privately for a while and had simply stopped editing out. Neither of them commented on it. He listened to her footsteps crossing the frozen ground back toward the main house, and when the door closed, he sat on the porch for a while longer in the dark, and he thought about Catherine, 4 years old, 1869, and he pulled Noah's voice through the cottage wall toward himself like a lifeline and held on to it, the small, ordinary miracle of a child talking to himself about nothing in the next room. He went in. What happened in March was the thing Caleb had been braced for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. He came into town on a Thursday to pick up roofing nails and a length of copper pipe from the hardware supplier and found 3 men waiting by his wagon when he came back out. Not Langley's formal associates this time. Rougher than that, chosen for their size rather than their paperwork skills, standing in the street with the relaxed readiness of people who have been sent to make a point. The largest one said, Mercer. Yeah, Caleb said. He stopped about 6 feet from them, which was a considered distance. Mr. Langley wants you to understand something. I'm listening. The legal situation with the Ashcroft estate is going to resolve itself one way or another. That's just paperwork and time. The man shifted his weight. What Mr. Langley would like you to understand personally is that there are things the law doesn't touch. Supply arrangements, business relationships. The kind of informal networks that make it easy or hard to operate in a territory. He paused, letting this settle. Mr. Langley has a long memory and a wide reach, and he's been very patient with this situation. He wants to know if there's a number. A number, Caleb said. Something that would make relocating feel reasonable. Fresh start somewhere else. You've got a kid. Man in your position could use a stake. Start over in Utah, in New Mexico. Mr. Langley's prepared to be generous. Caleb looked at the three of them. He thought about the fence posts driven in frozen ground, the cottage roof in a snowstorm, the morning coffee in Evelyn's kitchen, Noah pulling himself upright against the table leg, falling, getting up again. Tell Mr. Langley, he said, that there isn't a number. A pause. You should think carefully about that answer, the man said. I have. He picked up his crate of roofing nails. Are we done? They let him go, which told him something, that they were messengers, not operators, and that Langley hadn't yet decided to escalate beyond pressure, which meant the legal strategy was still his primary mechanism, and the men in the street were theater. He told Evelyn that evening. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, looking at some middle distance that wasn't the room but wasn't nowhere either, the look of a person processing. When he finished, she said, He offered you money to leave. Yes. How much? He almost smiled. He didn't get to the number. I didn't give him room. She looked at him directly. Why not? You could have let him get to it. Heard the amount, come back and told me. It would have been useful intelligence. I know. So why? Because I didn't want to hear the number, he said. Because there's a version of this where I sit here and tell you the number he named, and we're both sitting here wondering if I thought about it. He met her eyes. I didn't want you to wonder, and I didn't want to think about it. The room was very quiet. That's not a practical reason, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked away. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, the habitual posture she had when she was working something out. Caleb? His name again, the way she'd said it on the porch. I need to tell you something. He waited. When I paid your account at Fitch's store, she said slowly, I told myself it was a practical decision, that I needed work done. You needed work. The transaction was simple. She paused. I've been telling myself versions of that for 4 months. He was very still. I'm not interested in performing clarity I don't have, she said. I'm 46 years old, and I have not been young enough to be reckless for a considerable amount of time, but I think I owe you honesty. She looked at her hands. This stopped being a practical arrangement for me some time ago. I don't know what to do with that, and I'm not asking you to do anything with it either. She stopped, restarted. I thought you should know. Outside, the wind moved against the house. Inside the cottage, 20 yards away, Noah was asleep. Caleb looked at Evelyn Ashcroft, at the careful set of her shoulders, the deliberate flatness of her voice that was the way she managed the things that cost her the most, the hands on the table that were completely still in the concentrated way of hands that are working hard at being still. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. I know, he said. A long, careful pause. You know, she repeated, I've known for a while. I didn't say anything because he searched for the honest version of it. Because I didn't think I had the right to. You've given me work and shelter and legal protection, and I didn't want to. He stopped. I didn't want what I felt to be something you had to manage on top of everything else. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was doing several things at once, and she wasn't fully controlling it, which was unusual enough that it changed the quality of the room. That's a very considerate reason, she said. I have occasional moments. Something broke loose in her expression. Not tears, nothing dramatic, just the sudden absence of the particular held tension she'd been carrying since October, since before October, since longer ago than either of them could precisely locate. I'm not built for, she started. Neither am I, he said. Right now, I don't think that means, no, she said. I don't think it does either. They sat with that for a while. The lamp burned low. Somewhere in the house, Martha moved through a hallway, her footsteps unhurried and tactfully distant. The blizzard came on a Saturday. Caleb felt it before he saw it. A change in the air pressure in the early morning, a quality to the silence outside that was different from ordinary winter silence, denser somehow, loaded. He'd grown up in mountain country, and he'd learned young to read the particular warning that serious weather broadcasts before it arrives, the atmosphere tightening like a fist. He went outside at 6 in the morning and looked north. What he saw on the horizon was not a storm in the way that the December snow had been a storm. It was a wall, a gray-black horizontal mass moving with a deliberateness that real violence has. Not fast, not theatrical, just coming, the way something comes when it doesn't need to hurry because it's going to get there regardless. He went back inside and got Noah and took him up to the main house. Martha met him at the door. "I see it," she said. "Where's your husband?" "Town. He won't make it back before it hits." "Get the stores in." He handed Noah to her. "Everything you can move from the outbuildings. I'll get the animals." Evelyn was already in her coat at the foot of the stairs. "The root cellar," she said. "The new door has a strong bolt. I stocked it with supplies last week." "Good," Caleb said. "Stay inside once I've got the animals in." "Caleb, I mean it. This isn't the December snow. Stay inside." She looked at him with the expression that meant she was noting his instruction without necessarily agreeing to comply with it, which he recognized by now as her version of okay for the moment. He went out. The next 4 hours were the kind of work that strips everything down to the essential. He got the 2 horses and the mule into the reinforced stable, blocked the doors, moved what supplies he could from the outer storage shed into the covered walkway between the main house and the kitchen outbuilding. The wind picked up steadily, incrementally, the way serious wind does, but not gusting but building, each quarter hour worse than the last, until by mid-morning the visibility was under 20 yards and getting worse. He came back inside at 10 o'clock, ice in his beard, 3 fingers on his left hand going worryingly numb. Martha pressed a hot cloth around his hand and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of statement. Noah was on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and an overturned pot, conducting an investigation of some kind, unbothered. Evelyn was at the window. "The cottage," she said without turning. He came and looked. The cottage was not visible through the white, which could mean nothing. Visibility was nearly nothing, or could mean something. The weight of the snow, the amount of accumulation in the last 2 hours, the east roof section that he'd fixed, but the west section that was still... A sound came through the wind, not a crack, more like a prolonged exhalation, the sound of something giving way under sustained pressure rather than all at once. "That's the roof," Caleb said. He was already moving toward his coat. "Caleb," Evelyn's voice was sharp. "Noah's things are in the cottage. He stopped. It wasn't Noah's things. He knew it wasn't Noah's things. He was trying to locate the real reason, and it was this. The cottage was his. The first thing in a very long time that was his, that he had built himself, that he had made from nothing, and he could not stand at a window and watch it go without... "The root cellar," Evelyn said. She was right beside him, putting on her coat. "If the roof went, the root cellar is protected by the foundation walls. Whatever's in there is safe. You're not coming with me. I'm coming with you. Evelyn, tell me I'm wrong about the root cellar." He couldn't. They went out into the blizzard together. The world outside the door was white and loud and disorienting in a way that was immediately physical. The wind hit him like a wall, drove the snow horizontal into his face, took the air right out of the first breath he tried to pull. He grabbed the guide rope he'd strung between the main house and the cottage in December for exactly this kind of situation, and pulled himself along it hand over hand with Evelyn right behind him, her free hand locked around his coat. 20 yards had never taken so long. The cottage came into view through the white as a shape first, then a wrongness in the shape. The east side, not the section he'd rebuilt. He'd done that right, but the connecting section between old and new had gone. The weight of 4 feet of wet snow in 6 hours had found the weakest joint, and the roof had pancaked inward on the east side, the wall below it buckling. The main room was accessible, half of it, anyway. Caleb pushed through the door and took inventory fast. Nothing structural at imminent risk on the west side. The stove undamaged, the crib where Noah slept was in the west room and intact, and in the floor beside it the root cellar hatch, which he pulled open. He looked down into the root cellar and heard, from somewhere beneath the debris that had fallen when the east wall buckled, a sound that stopped his heart. Not Noah. Noah was safe in the main house, on the kitchen floor with a spoon and a pot. He knew that. But there was a sound. He stood absolutely still and listened through the wind, and he heard it again. A thin, high, rhythmic sound, barely audible, coming from under the fallen beams on the east side of the room. He turned to Evelyn. "There's something alive under there," he said. She was already looking at the debris. The cat, Martha's cat, a gray tabby named for no one in particular who'd lived on the property since before Caleb arrived, and who had apparently found the root cellar a good shelter for the same reasons Evelyn had cited, was underneath a roof beam and 2 fallen wallboards, alive, with a broken rear leg and a level of vocal outrage that under other circumstances would have been impressive. It took 40 minutes to get her out. The beams were heavy, and the space was wrong, and Caleb's numb fingers were a serious liability, and Evelyn was the one who finally got her hands under the cat at the right angle to lift her clear while Caleb held the beam with the last of what his arms had. When they got back to the main house, hand over hand again on the guide rope, Evelyn carrying the cat inside her coat, Martha looked at them and then at the cat and closed her eyes briefly. "Foolish animal," she said to the cat, in a tone that was not actually addressing the cat. Caleb sat down on the kitchen bench and could not immediately get up again. His back had locked. His hands were bad. He'd been running on the particular fuel that emergencies provide, and the fuel was gone. Evelyn sat beside him. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, close, the warmth of her immediate and real after the white cold outside. Noah abandoned the spoon and pot and crawled across the kitchen floor to Caleb and pulled himself upright against Caleb's knee and looked up at him with the grave, focused expression he'd been developing lately, the one that suggested he was taking a careful census of his available people. Caleb put his damaged hand on top of Noah's head. "Hey," he said. Noah said something in his own language that had the cadence of an assessment. "Yeah," Caleb said. "We're okay." From inside Evelyn's coat, the cat made a sound of continuing complaint. Martha said, "I'll need to splint that leg." "Can you?" Caleb asked. "I've splinted worse," Martha said, which was probably true. The storm reached its peak in the late afternoon and maintained that peak for 6 hours, and the 5 of them, Caleb, Evelyn, Martha, Noah, and a cat with a temporarily splinted leg, stayed in the main house kitchen because it was the warmest room, and because there was no practical alternative, and because in serious weather, the social distances that structure ordinary life reveal themselves as the fragile conveniences they actually are. They ate. Martha produced a meal from what was on hand, which was considerable because she was the kind of person who kept things on hand. Noah ate and fell asleep in Caleb's arms and was put to bed in the small room off the kitchen that had been, Evelyn said without elaborating, Catherine's room, which was the first time Caleb had heard the room referred to since their porch conversation in February. Somewhere past 10 o'clock, with the wind still running hard outside and the house holding around them with the solid stubbornness of good construction, Caleb said, "The cottage can be repaired." "I know," Evelyn said. "The east wall is the issue. If the foundation held, it will have held. Then it's a rebuild on the east side and a full roof replacement, 6 weeks in good weather." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was burning low again, the same way it always seemed to be burning low when they were saying the things that mattered, as if the light knew to give them some cover. "You don't have to live in it while you're rebuilding it," she said. "There are rooms here." He looked at her. "That's a different arrangement than what we agreed to," he said. "It's a practical response to a collapsed roof," she said, "which is also a different situation than what we agreed to." He considered this. "Martha will talk," he said. "Martha has been talking since December," Evelyn said. "She's just been doing it internally, which for Martha is an extraordinary exercise of restraint." From the direction of the bedroom hallway, with uncanny timing, Martha's voice came. "I can hear you." Evelyn looked at the hallway, then back at Caleb. The shape of something in her face that was neither the fraction nor the ghost of a smile, but an actual one, brief and unguarded, the first he'd seen at full measure. "Stay," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls of the main house with everything it had, and the house held. The morning after the blizzard, the world was unrecognizable. That was the only word for it. Caleb stood at the back door of the main house in the early gray light and looked out at a landscape that had been rearranged overnight by something that didn't negotiate. The cottonwood trees along the drive were bent under accumulated weight, their shapes wrong, some of them split at the fork. The fence line along the upper pasture had vanished entirely beneath a continuous white surface. The stable roof held. He'd reinforced it in November with that specific concern in mind. But the outer storage shed had gone the same way as the cottage east wall, the roof pancaked, the south wall pushed out by the weight. The cottage itself was visible now in the morning stillness, and it looked worse in the absence of the storm than it had in the middle of it. The east side was not merely damaged. It was open to the sky over roughly a third of the floor plan, the wall below the failed roof section leaning outward at an angle that meant it needed to come down before anything else could go up. He stood there long enough that Evelyn appeared beside him with coffee. She looked at the cottage without speaking for a moment. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. They drank their coffee. "The foundation wall is intact," he said. It was the thing he'd checked first, in the early light, wading through chest-high drifts to get close enough to assess it. "The framing on the west side is sound. It's the east third that's a complete redo." "How long?" 8 weeks, maybe 7 if the spring weather cooperates, which it won't. He looked at the damaged structure. "I want to do it differently this time. The way the east and west sections connected was always the weak joint. If I rebuild, I want to take the whole roof off and do it as one continuous pitch instead of the 2 sections." Evelyn nodded slowly. She was looking at the same thing he was looking at, but he'd noticed long ago that what she saw when she looked at property was something different from what most people saw. Not the damage, but the structure underneath the damage, the bones of what was possible. "That's the right call," she said. "What do you need to start?" "A week to clear the debris and assess what's reusable. Then lumber, and the specific hardware for the ridge beam. I'll need to order it from Denver. The Durango suppliers don't carry the span width I need." She was already calculating. He could see it in the set of her face, the slight narrowing of attention. "I'll send the order today. The road should be passable by tomorrow." They went back inside. Noah was awake in Catherine's room, had been awake for some time by the sound of it, conducting his usual dawn monologue with the same earnest self-assurance he brought to everything. Caleb went and got him and brought him back to the kitchen and sat him on the floor with a bread crust while Martha started the stove. And for a few minutes, the 4 of them moved through the morning routine with the naturalness of people who had been doing it long enough that it had stopped requiring navigation. Caleb noticed this. He noticed it the way you notice a thing that has become unremarkable and then suddenly, in a sideways morning moment, becomes remarkable again. The particular ordinary miracle of people who have learned each other's rhythms. Martha knowing where everyone's cup was without asking. Evelyn setting the table for 4 without counting. Noah reaching toward Caleb with the bread crust in a gesture that was both offering and showing off. The toddler's need to share the good thing. He thought about the boarding house room in October, the coal burner on its last quarter pound, the milk tin in Fitch's hand. 6 months. The distance between those 2 mornings was 6 months, and also something that couldn't be measured in months. The legal situation with Langley resolved itself in April, which was earlier than anyone expected, and in a manner that Caleb would later describe to Martha as anticlimactic, which Martha would say was the word for most things that seem inevitable once they're over. Evelyn's Denver lawyer, a man named Cassius Holt, who communicated entirely in long, densely argued letters that Evelyn translated for Caleb in brief functional summaries, had spent 2 months quietly building a countercase around Langley's boundary survey challenge. The challenge itself was thin. Everyone who looked at it honestly said so. But Langley had used thin cases before and sustained them through attrition, and the plan had apparently been to do the same here. What Langley had not accounted for, or had accounted for incorrectly, was Evelyn's willingness to spend money on the counter. Previous targets had settled not because they were wrong, but because sustained legal process was more expensive than surrender, and Langley had optimized for that calculation. Evelyn was not optimizing for the same thing. She had the resources to outlast him, and she had, as Cassius Holt put it in one of his letters, in the driest possible prose, demonstrated a notable absence of motivation to settle. In April, Langley withdrew the boundary challenge. Evelyn read the notice at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and set it beside her coffee cup without expression. "It's done?" Caleb asked. "The boundary challenge is withdrawn." She picked up her cup. "He still has the option to file other challenges." "He won't. The cost-benefit no longer works in his favor, and Langley is fundamentally a practical man." She paused. "He'll find another property to pursue." "How do you know he won't come back to this one?" "Because I'm going to do something that makes this property less attractive to contest." She looked at him over her cup. "I want to transfer a portion of the land into your name now, not the whole parcel. The lease runs 3 years, and I think the terms of the lease should be honored. I don't want to shortcut what you've committed to completing. But the cottage site and the immediate acreage around it. Your name on that portion now, legal and recorded." He looked at her. "That wasn't part of the arrangement," he said. "The arrangement was to protect your situation," she said. "This protects it better. Or it looks like something it isn't and gives the gossips more to work with." "The gossips," she said with a particular dryness, "have been working with what they have for 6 months and haven't slowed down noticeably. I've stopped managing for their benefit." He sat with this for a moment. "I don't want it to look like what?" "Not a challenge. Genuine." He pulled at the honest version of it. "Like you're paying me to stay." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the first real warmth of spring was working at the snow that remained. The sound of meltwater running somewhere under the remaining snowpack, a constant low note under everything. "Caleb." She set down the cup. "You've been offered money to leave and you refused it without hearing the number. You've slept in a partially constructed cottage in a Colorado winter rather than accept more than you felt you'd earned. You've rebuilt a fence, a roof, a floor, a door, a porch, an entire east wall, and you're about to rebuild the rest of it. And in 3 years, you will have earned every inch of the legal right to this property through work that would have cost me twice what I'm paying you at market rate." She paused. "I am not paying you to stay. I am recognizing that you are already here." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. The land transfer was filed with the county clerk the following week. Harold Fitch, who still ran the general store on Main Street and who heard about the filing through the network of information that small commercial cities maintain in lieu of a formal news service, reportedly told a customer that he wasn't surprised, that he'd seen something coming from the first moment the Ashcroft woman paid that miner's tab, that he'd always been a good judge of these situations. Caleb heard this secondhand from the lumber supplier, who told it as a friendly story. He didn't respond to it, but he thought about it on the drive back to the ridge, about Harold Fitch and his extended hand, flat and contemptuous, and the sound the milk tin had made on the counter, and the 8 people in that store who had found something else to look at, and the one person who hadn't. He thought about what it cost to be that person, not the money. That was the least of it. The cost of being the person who doesn't look away when looking away is the easier option. The cost Evelyn had been paying since December, in business relationships and social standing and the sustained energy of holding her ground against people with more conventional power. He'd asked her once, in February, whether she regretted it. Not the school, not the lease, the whole thing. The decision made in Fitch's store on a cold October morning that had reorganized both of their lives. She'd been quiet for a long enough time that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I regret that it took something as extreme as watching a man be humiliated over a baby's milk for me to do what I should have been doing for years." He hadn't known what to say to that. He still didn't exactly, but he thought about it often. The school opened in September. It was not a grand opening. Evelyn had been specifically resistant to anything that looked like self-congratulation, a position that the 3 women on the school committee, railroad wives who had organized the community piece of it with the focused efficiency of people who'd been waiting for this opportunity for years, had pushed back on, arguing reasonably that the children's families deserved an occasion. The compromise was a simple gathering, a morning with food brought by the families, a brief formal recognition, and then the actual beginning of the school day, which was the point. 41 children showed up for the first day. Caleb stood at the back of the room and watched a young woman named Ada Coffey, who'd been teaching in a church basement in Durango for 2 years without pay, because that was the only option available, stand at the front of a proper classroom with proper desks and windows that actually had glass in them, and explain to 41 children between the ages of 6 and 14 how the next 9 months were going to work. Noah, 14 months old and recently and enthusiastically mobile, was on Caleb's hip doing his ongoing census of available interesting things, which currently included a red-haired boy of about 7 who was making faces at him from the third row. Evelyn was beside Caleb. She was watching Ada Coffey, and her expression was the most undefended he'd ever seen it in a public setting. Not soft exactly, but open. All the careful management she normally applied to her public face simply absent. "She reminds me of someone," Caleb said quietly. Evelyn glanced at him. "Mrs. Garrity," he said. She looked back at the classroom. "Yes," she said, "she does." He thought about a woman in Ohio 40 years ago teaching 30 children like their futures were worth investing in. He thought about the specific accumulated weight of good things done by ordinary people, how it moves through time in ways the person who started it never gets to see. How Mrs. Garrity almost certainly died without knowing that one of her students had carried the shape of what she did for 40 years and eventually built a room for 41 children on a Colorado ridge. He didn't say any of this out loud. It was the kind of thought that felt smaller in words than it did in the space it occupied. The Langley matter surfaced once more, briefly, in October, almost exactly 1 year after the morning in Fitch's store. A new legal inquiry was filed, this time about water rights on the south boundary, and this time Cassius Holt dispatched it in 3 weeks with a letter that was, by his standards, almost terse. Langley did not file again. He'd found his other property, as Evelyn had predicted, a large parcel southeast of Durango whose previous owner, a sheep farmer with fewer resources and less resolve, had found the legal attrition exactly as costly as Langley had calculated. Caleb heard about the sheep farmer through the territory's networks. He didn't know the man, but he thought about him. He thought about the version of himself that might have taken the number in March, in the street outside the hardware store. He couldn't say with certainty that version of himself didn't exist. He'd been very tired in March. His hands had been split at the knuckles since January, and his back was a running problem, and Noah was teething again, and Langley's man had said fresh start in Utah, in New Mexico, as if starting over were a simple thing a man with a toddler and no capital did casually, as if the only thing anchoring Caleb to the North Ridge was inconvenience rather than the specific gravity of a life that had started to mean something. He hadn't taken the number. He was not going to perform certainty about why. The honest accounting was that he hadn't taken it because by March, the North Ridge was his in the way that mattered, before the legal documents caught up. Not his by ownership, but his by the knowledge of every fence post and roof beam and floorboard he'd put in, by Noah's face in the morning light of that kitchen, by a woman who'd sat beside him in a blizzard's aftermath and said, "Stay with the simplicity of someone who had stopped packaging her wants in acceptable language." The cottage was fully rebuilt by November. The new roof was a single continuous pitch, as Caleb had designed it, and it was better than what had been there before. Better even than what he'd built the first time. Stronger at the joints, properly ventilated, built with the specific knowledge of what the Colorado winter could throw at it, because he'd watched it throw exactly that. He moved back into it in November, which had been the plan, the practical, sensible plan that respected the arrangement and everybody's stated intentions. He lasted 11 days. Not because the cottage was uncomfortable. It was the best it had ever been, warm and solid and genuinely his. But because the main house was 200 feet away, and he'd been taking his morning coffee there since December of the previous year, and Noah had taken his first real assisted steps in Martha's kitchen, and the path between the cottage and the house was worn into the ground now with the particular intentionality of regular use, and 11 days was long enough to establish that what he'd called practical was a description that had stopped fitting sometime in the late spring, and he'd kept using it because the alternative required a conversation. He went up to the main house on an evening in late November and knocked on the front door. which he hadn't done since October of the previous year, which felt like a different geography. Evelyn opened it. She looked at him with the expression that was not surprise. "I'm not good at being 11 days away from where I actually want to be," he said. She leaned against the door frame. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you be bad at it from the study window." "You could have said something. I was waiting for you to figure it out." He looked at her. "How long were you going to wait?" She considered this with apparent seriousness. "I had estimated another 2 weeks," she said, "but I was prepared to revise." He stood on the porch of the main house, the house that had been built too large for one person, that had held its emptiness like a held breath for 7 years, that had started to feel different around October of last year in ways Evelyn had been attributing to practical arrangements and the presence of a useful employee, and had eventually stopped being able to attribute to anything except the truth. "Evelyn," he said. "Caleb," she said. "I'm 34 years old and I have a toddler and a rebuilt cottage I designed myself, and I've been in love with you since February, and I don't have a speech." "I'm 46, she said. "I'm not looking for a speech." "What are you looking for?" She was quiet for a moment. The November air was very still. Above the ridge, the sky was the particular deep blue of cold, clear nights, the stars doing their usual indifferent, brilliant work. "Someone who stays," she said. "Someone who shows up when they say they will and does what they say they'll do and doesn't manage me." She paused. "And someone who tells me when the door jamb isn't level." He almost laughed. It came out shorter than a laugh, more honest. The sound of a man who has been handed the exact right sentence at the exact right moment and doesn't quite know how to hold it. "I can do that," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. They were married the following April in the orchard on the North Ridge, with the 3 new trees Caleb had planted in the spring beginning to put out their first cautious growth, and the older trees in the restored rows behind them in early bloom, and Noah, 19 months old, walking with the determined, lunging efficiency of a toddler who has decided that running will come later, but forward motion will not wait. Making his own investigation of the proceedings from Martha's arms. There was no large ceremony. Evelyn had not wanted one, and Caleb had not wanted one, and the absence of one meant the people who were there were specifically the people they wanted, which was a small number and the right ones. Martha and her husband Thomas, who had returned from town the morning after the blizzard to find a rearranged household and had absorbed this information with the equanimity of a man long accustomed to his wife being ahead of events. Ate a coffee from the school, because Evelyn had wanted her there and couldn't fully explain why, except that it felt right. Cassius Holt had sent a letter of congratulation from Denver, which arrived 3 days late and was very formally worded and was, in its way, touching. Caleb stood in the orchard in his good coat, a new one, the first new coat he'd owned in 4 years, which still felt slightly unfamiliar across the shoulders. And he looked at Evelyn beside him in the April light, and he thought about something she had said to him back in the winter, on the cottage step in the cold, that wealth without compassion had already cost her too much. He hadn't fully understood it then. He understood it better now. Not the wealth part. He didn't think of the Ashcroft holdings in those terms, had never been able to, the numbers being too abstract against the specific reality of fence posts and roof beams, and the weight of a hammer in cold hands. What he understood was the cost part. The cost of living at a distance from your own life. The cost of maintaining the careful structure of a respectable solitude when what you actually needed was for one specific person to knock on your door and be unable to articulate why they'd come except that they were bad at being elsewhere. He understood that cost because he'd been paying a version of it since Clara died. Not solitude. He'd had Noah, had never been alone in the absolute sense, but distance, the careful management of his own need. The performance of self-sufficiency, that is the one thing pride demands of men who've been knocked down and refused to stay there. Evelyn had knocked that performance sideways without trying to, simply by asking him, in a general store in October, whether 2 tins or 3 was sufficient, the question of what made a life. He'd been circling it for a year. The answer he'd arrived at was not elegant. It was not the kind of answer you could hand to someone in a sentence. It had something to do with showing up. Not the grandiose showing up of dramatic moments, though those came too, as the blizzard came. but the daily, unremarkable showing up that built the path worn into the ground between the cottage and the main house. The fence post driven a foot deeper so it wouldn't heave again. The door jamb adjusted a quarter inch because it wasn't quite level, and level mattered. The morning coffee made for 4 instead of 3 because the arithmetic had changed and someone had the clarity to acknowledge it. That was the thing Fitch had not understood, standing behind his counter with the flat outstretched hand and the contempt for a man who couldn't settle his tab. Fitch understood debts and balances and the transactional architecture of a general store in a frontier city. He didn't understand, and Caleb had watched enough men like Fitch in his life to believe this was a fundamental incapacity rather than a temporary oversight, that some of the most significant exchanges between human beings don't fit on a ledger, that the woman who doesn't look away is paying something and receiving something, and that both the payment and the receipt have consequences that spread outward in ways neither party can track. The school had 53 students by its second year. Ada Coffey hired an assistant teacher, a young man from the railroad families whose own education had been patchy and interrupted, and who turned out to have a gift for arithmetic instruction that the children responded to with something approaching devotion. The Mercer property. It was called that now, the Mercer property, the name having migrated naturally through the territory's networks over the course of the year following the land transfer, as if it had always been accurate and was only now being formally acknowledged, produced its first significant harvest in the autumn of the second full year, and the quality of the fruit from the restored orchard was specific enough that a supplier in Denver asked about a regular arrangement, which Caleb negotiated himself, directly, in a letter that Evelyn read over his shoulder and corrected once, a small thing about payment timing that he'd gotten slightly wrong. "You should have let me write it," she said. "I wanted to write it myself." "I know." She handed it back. "That's why I only corrected one thing." Victor Langley remained in the territory. His operation continued to expand, absorbing properties whose owners lacked the combination of resources and stubbornness that had made the North Ridge unprofitable to pursue. Caleb saw him once, at a distance, at a public land assessment meeting in Durango, and Langley had looked across the room and found Caleb's eyes and held them for a moment with an expression that was neither threat nor concession, but something more like the honest acknowledgement of a man who does not lose often and has filed this particular loss in the appropriate place and moved on. Caleb held his gaze and then looked away first, because there was nothing he needed to prove to Victor Langley, and the meeting was starting. Harold Fitch retired in 1891 and sold the store to a younger man who removed the old counter and put in a new one, and the dented milk tin that had sat behind Fitch's register for 2 years, kept there for reasons Fitch never explained to anyone, ended up among a box of items sold to a general buyer, which is how it eventually, through a series of unremarkable transactions, made its way to a shelf in a different store, where it sat for another year before Caleb's wife noticed it and bought it for reasons she explained to her husband as practical and that were not, in any interpretation, practical. She brought it home and set it on the kitchen windowsill. Caleb looked at it. It was dented on the left side, the label mostly gone, a small rust circle on the lid from being stored somewhere damp. "I know it's the same one," Evelyn said. "The dent is in exactly the right place." "I know it's the same one too," he said. They looked at it for a moment. "It was the worst morning of the last 4 years," he said. "I know," she said. "I was there." He picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. He set it back down. "Why did you buy it?" She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, she wasn't looking at the tin, but at the window. At the orchard beyond it in its autumn version, the leaves turned, the harvest mostly done. "Because bad mornings are part of the record too," she said, "and I don't want to only keep the good parts." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The tin stayed on the windowsill. Noah grew up knowing the story of the tin the way children know family stories, in layers, understanding more of it as he got older, the early version being simply the tin from when he was a baby, and the fuller version arriving in pieces over years as the context assembled itself. He knew about the store in Fitch's hand and the woman in the dark coat who hadn't looked away. He knew about the blizzard and the cottage and the 3 men outside the hardware store whose message Caleb hadn't accepted. He knew about the school and Ada Coffey and the 53 students in the second year. What he understood, growing up on the North Ridge with an orchard that bloomed every April, and parents who argued about door jams and payment timing, and whether the Northeast fence needed replacing this year or could go another season. What he understood was not the dramatic version of the story, not the version where the crisis was the point. He understood the version where the crisis was just what happened before the life that the crisis turned out to be clearing space for. He grew up and left and came back, as children do. He brought his own son to the kitchen table where he had once pulled himself upright against the leg and conducted his assessments of available people, and the boy did the same, and found the table solid in the same way, and the people at it reliable in the ways that mattered. He brought the boy to Fitch's old store one afternoon, which had been 3 other things since Fitch, but still stood on the same corner of the same street. The current owner didn't know the history, but Noah told his son the story anyway, on the sidewalk outside, the whole of it, the tin and the hand and the woman who asked 2 or 3. The boy was 7 years old, and he listened with the serious attention of a child who understands that a story being told this way, in front of this building, means something. She could have just given him money, the boy said. She could have, Noah said. Why didn't she? Noah thought about this for a moment. He'd thought about it before, had had his own version of this conversation with his father years ago, and the answer had not gotten simpler over time, which was the sign that it was the right question. Because money fixes the problem, he said. She was interested in the person. The boy considered this with the focused gravity of 7-year-olds faced with ideas that are slightly too large and exactly interesting enough to sit with. Is that harder? He asked. Yeah, Noah said. It's harder. Was it worth it? Noah looked at the building that had once been Fitch's general store. He thought about the tin on the kitchen windowsill, the orchard in April, the path worn between the cottage and the main house, his father's hands, always slightly scarred at the knuckles from the winter of 1888, and his stepmother's voice saying level mattered with the dry precision of a woman who had decided that some things were worth being exacting about. Yeah, he said. It was worth it. He put his hand on his son's head, the same gesture, though he didn't know it consciously, that his father had used on him on 100 ordinary mornings, the specific weight of a parent's hand that says, I see you, I have you, we're here. And they walked back through Durango in the afternoon light, and behind them on the North Ridge the orchard was doing what it did every year, reliably and without drama. The trees bearing what they bore, the land holding what it held, the path between the cottage and the main house worn into the ground by 20 years of daily use, and still, every morning, being walked.